we're going to go ahead and call the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Revenue to order. Madam Secretary, please call the roll.
Assemblymember De Silva. Assemblymember Gallant. Assemblymember Nguyen. Assemblymember O'Neill.
Here.
Vice Chair Backus.
Present.
Senator Doñate. Senator Ellison.
Here.
Chair Neal.
Here. Please mark Assemblyman Nguyen present as he arrives, Assemblyman De Silva when he arrives, and then also Senator Ellison when he arrives. So we will go ahead and move to agenda item number 2. Is there anyone here for public comment? Is there anyone in Carson? Seeing no one. We will go ahead and then we're gonna welcome our, I need to do, Oh, is there anyone online on the phone lines for public comment?
Chair, the public line is open and working. However, there are no callers at this time.
Okay, thank you for that. So with that, I will close public comment and then I will move to agenda item number 4, which is the approval of the minutes for January 21st, 2026. It's super simple. As everyone had, I don't know if everybody can see those minutes. Everybody had a chance to review those minutes from January 21st. Are there any questions or any comments? Seeing no questions and comments, I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes from January 21st, 2026.
So moved.
Second. So I have a first from Assemblywoman Backus, a second from Assemblywoman Gallant. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing no opposition, the motion passes to approve the minutes from January 21st, 2026. All right, so that agenda item 4 is closed. We'll move to agenda item number 5, which is the overview and discussion of Nevada's sales and use tax. And then we'll have Mr. Nakamoto present.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the Joint Interim Standing Committee on Revenue. For the record, my name is Michael Nakamoto, and I serve as Chief Principal Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division. There are, under Agenda Item 5, there are several documents that I will make some reference to. The gist of this agenda item, though, is in the presentation, which begins on page 73. And yes, it is 70 pages long, but I will try to go through it as quickly as possible. But there are several other documents that are available. First is on page 145 in the packet is a table of the component sales and use tax rates by county. So you can see what the rates are in each of the 17 counties, as well as the statutory authority and the purpose for local option rates as well. And then speaking of local option rates, on page 149 is a summary of the local option sales tax rates and the actual collections for FY24 and 25. And that notes the county in which it's imposed, the purpose, and the rate, as well as those collections. In addition, there is another piece of information that we put together outside of the packet, but it is basically a series of tables and charts that go through and do comparisons of historical sales and use tax collections for the state 2% rate. And it's the comparisons there are also including inflation adjusted and inflation adjusted per capita. If there are questions about those, I can answer them, but I did not intend on spending a lot of time, mostly because there is a 70-page presentation. Again, the presentation begins on page 73, and I will go to page 74. which is an overview of the 5 topics that we're going to go through. And the first one is just a high-level overview of the sales and use tax itself. So the sales and use tax in Nevada was first established in 1955. It is by revenue amount the largest single source of revenue for the state general fund, making up about close to 30% of the total state general fund revenue, and that's the 2% piece that you see listed there. The local school support tax benefits K-12 education. The basic city county relief tax and supplemental city county relief tax are part of the consolidated tax distribution that affects local governments. And then there are local option taxes that I will discuss as well. The tax is imposed upon all retailers in the state on the tangible sale or use of tangible personal property. Sales being, I go to, say, the Maverick down here and I bought breakfast. If it was subject to the sales tax, I would pay the sales tax. For use tax, if I bought something online and the sales tax was not collected, I would have a statutory liability to pay the use tax directly to the Department of Taxation. So Nevada is one of 45 states that levy a state sales tax. The 5 states that do not have a statewide sales tax are Alaska, Delaware, Montana, New Hampshire, and Oregon. 4 of those 5 states have some sort of sales tax, primarily at the local level. New Hampshire has a tax on prepared food and room rentals that they call the meals and rooms tax. And then of the 45 states that impose a sales tax, Vermont was the last one to institute one in 1969. So we were kind of ahead of the curve, at least in comparison to Vermont. So the components of the sales and use tax start with the state sales and use tax rate of 2%, with the proceeds going to the state general fund. Taxpayers in any instance are allowed to retain 0.25% of their taxes due as reimbursement for cost of collecting the tax at what we call the Taxpayer Collection Allowance. The Sales and Use Tax Act of 1955 was Senate Bill 171 of the 1955 session, and then was placed on the ballot by voter referendum in the 1956 general election and was approved. And under the provisions in the state constitution, once that occurs, any changes to the Sales and Use Tax Act require voter approval. The next portion is the local school support tax, which is imposed at a rate of 2.6%. The proceeds, less a 0.75% collection commission that's retained by the state for the general fund, goes to the state education fund. The LSST was created by Senate Bill 15 of the 1967 session at a rate of 1%. The rate was increased to 1.5% in 1981, to 2.25% in 1991, and then to 2.6% temporarily during the 2009 session. That temporary rate increase was extended for 2 years in 2011, and then for another 2 years in 2013. And then Senate Bill 483 of the 2015 session made that rate change permanent. Next is the basic city county relief tax, or the BCCRT. It is imposed at a rate of 0.5%. The state general fund retains a commission of 1.75% for the cost of administering the tax, and then the remainder goes to the local government tax distribution account and flows through the consolidated tax distribution. This was created during the 1969 session as an optional tax. By 1980, 15 of Nevada's 17 counties were imposing it. And then Senate Bill 254, or sorry, Assembly Bill 369 in the 1981 session required the imposition of this rate by all 17 counties. The other component that is part of the C-tax is the Supplemental City County Relief Tax, or the SCCRT, which is imposed at a rate of 1.75%. And again, the distribution is the same. It goes through the C-tax. There is a slightly different distribution at the first tier of the C-tax, and I'm not going to go through all that because that in and of itself is a 4-hour presentation.
Can I ask a question really quick?
Absolutely.
So I think it would be helpful just because as we're, I guess, going through the process of examining, right? So there's a lot of conversation out there around sales tax is too high. Just really quick, can you just say, like, why was the basic city county relief tax created, right? And then the supplemental city county relief tax, because, when you look at it and you get a chance to like look at something, 15 years later, it was like all these add-ons in order to support government activity, right? That's how I interpret it and break it down. But why did the cities or counties keep adding these taxes to their basic base?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michael Nakamoto for the record. It was actually the legislature that added them. And so it is imposed by legislative authority, not by the cities and counties themselves. I can't specifically tell you why the CCRT was created back in 1969 at the 0.5% rate. What I can tell you is that the 2.25%, the combined BCCRT and SCCRT, was added during the 1981 session as part of what is historically called the tax shift. And so basically what had happened is that most local governments and the state had their own property tax rates going all the way up to the constitutional limit of $5. So in the late 70s and early 80s, there was this shift away from property taxes and towards sales tax. That is when the current statutory rate cap of $3.64 per $100 of assessed value was put into place. And so the BCCRT and the SCCRT were designed for local governments to replace that revenue. So basically it was trying to get them revenue because they were going to be losing property tax revenue. And that's really the genesis of the BCCRT and the SCCRT. All of the CTAX stuff came later, but those rates exist because of the forced reduction in property tax.
That is super, super helpful, I think, because as we go along, right, in our conversations through August, I'm trying to set context, because currently there is once again, a shift, I would say a policy shift that's surfacing where folks want to reduce sales tax and then try to tamper with property tax. But the reason why we have these particular two taxes is because we had a reduction in property tax, right? And so I'm saying this to try to make it plain so that when folks start pushing their ideas, that they're putting things in context to how we depressed one area of revenue and then increase in another area of revenue. Not being mindful of the context that in 1981 we didn't have 3 million Nevadans. So the scale of your decisions and what you pull triggers on matters, because it still needs to serve the services of 3 million Nevadans, right? And so I just wanted to put that out there just because I know a lot of people are thinking like, oh, sales tax is too high. That may be true. However, it didn't come without a shift in another area. And so with that, you go ahead and continue. I'm just trying to set my platform on where I'm going and how I'm thinking about taxes and revenue. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michael Nakamoto for the record. And your question actually set up my next point. And as I noted in the answer to your question, the SCCRT was designed to replace lost property tax revenue. So the distribution was in relation to the amount of property tax that was being lost. Those distribution formulas were significantly changed in Assembly Bill 104 of the 1991 session, which is referred to as the Fair Share Bill. And those are the distributions that we have today, and it's largely the genesis for what became the CTAX. distribution of the SCCRT, which again, I'm not going to spend time on because it's a 4-hour presentation by itself. Lastly, there are 13 counties that levy at least one local option tax. You can see the total combined sales tax rate by county. If you see a county there that has a rate of 6.85%, and that is Esmeralda, Eureka, Humboldt, and Mineral, they don't have any local option taxes. That 6.85% is the sum of the state 2% rate, the LSST, the BCCRT, and the SCCRT. Anybody who has a rate that's higher than that, all the way up to Clark County's 8.375%, has at least one local option tax. In the case of Clark County, there are 6 different local option taxes. And again, the tables on pages 145 and 149 will give more information about those specific uses. But the uses that would be listed are infrastructure improvements, flood control, schools, public utilities, railways, mass transit, public safety, various kinds of things that are allowed in statute, either by an act of the legislature in NRS or via a special or local act. The individual rates range from 0.1% to 0.54%. That 5.54% is for school capital construction in Washoe County. And as I noted, they can be imposed either by statute or special act. I've mentioned the C-Tax and that I could do a 4-hour presentation on it, but I've distilled the C-Tax down into one slide.
So, because something I mean, I'm not going to keep stopping you, but on the local option taxes, when I look at these different counties, is there something that we can look at and we can determine, like, get a chart to see when the tax was initially created, what their population was, and then what their population loss is, and why the rural counties are feeling like there is a heavier burden on the sales tax conversation? Because in my mind, the way I interpret it is that there are not enough people to sustain the rate, right? So if you do not have enough population to support what your existing services are, then the burden seems heavy because a smaller group is shouldering that tax burden, right? That's how I'm processing it. And then on top of that, you have a limited tourism activity where you have transient residents who also can come in and offset that burden, right? Because you have temporary residents who then come in and where the tax can be applied to then shoulder a certain kind of activity. And so it would be good to kind of see that, just because on an economic development side and on a revenue side, really examining, like when we pull one trigger for Clark, it's not going to have the same effect for the rural county because their population can't sustain it. And so I kind of, maybe in the future, just kind of get into this conversation on, what is an appropriate revenue remedy that, if parity could exist in counties where they're losing population, how do we actually balance out the revenue need, right? I don't know if it's possible, but I think it would be good to see, like what I started off with. What population did they have when the tax started? What did they believe their revenue increase would be? How has the population loss changed their revenue structure, where now they are heavily burdened, and they can't figure out how to make up the difference in order to continue to supply services at that basic level that they started with, because that's what's going on, right? And I feel like we need a different strategy, economic development wise, for the rural counties in order to sustain themselves and actually continue to be a part of, I guess, a revenue conversation where they actually feel like they're actually going to benefit and not be overly burdened by an increase that we do, right? And I think that's why we always have the rules come up and say, you know, I hate this bill, I can't stand this bill, right? Because it is a different conversation for them. So, okay, I'm done with my diatribe.
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record, if I can just make one observation, specifically as it pertains to the local option taxes. The local option taxes are indeed optional. The counties have the ability to impose them or not impose them as they see fit based on the authority that's given to them by the legislature. So each of the local option taxes, or many of them, have a requirement that they either be approved by their Board of County Commissioners or by their voters. And so there would be theoretical mechanisms for them if they chose to discontinue the imposition of those rates, that they could do that. However, again, they have specific uses and needs for those taxes because they can't just do it and throw it in their general fund unless the legislature gave them specific authority to do so. There are 2 counties that have an additional sales and use tax or an option rate that was given the authority to them by the legislature, and that's Churchill and Washoe counties, based on the fair share language bill back in 1991. But the rest of them are using it for some purpose, whether it's White Pine County and funding the maintenance and operation of their swimming pool, or Story County for the V&T Railroad, or any other purpose that is authorized in statute. They have their own purposes. So what you've asked for is something we can look into, and we will see what we can determine from that. So moving on to the C-Tax. Again, I'm not going to go into any great deal or detail on the C-Tax. Basically, it takes 6 different revenue sources: the BCCRT, the SCCRT that I just mentioned, liquor tax, cigarette tax, real property transfer tax, and the governmental services tax, and then redistributes the proceeds from those into smaller buckets at the first tier. So there's a bucket for each of the 17 counties, and then each of those 17 buckets gets distributed among the county, cities, towns, and other eligible government entities within those counties, which is the second tier distribution. So those are, that is done by the Department of Taxation on a monthly basis. They distribute money into what is known as the local government tax distribution account, and then they use statutory formulas to go through the first tier and the second tier of the C-Tax. The reason why the C-Tax was created was that each of the 6 C-Tax revenues had different revenue distribution rules when created, and they weren't really consistent other than that they were consistently inconsistent. So in 1995, the legislature passed Senate Concurrent Resolution 40 that tasked a subcommittee of the Legislative Commission to study the distribution of local government revenues and make recommendations. They came back with a recommendation that was passed in Senate Bill 254 of the 1997 session, and then was subsequently changed by the legislature during the 2013 session to have the C-Tax become what we know it today. And the reason why I mention it here is because BCCRT and SCCRT make up the vast majority of total C-Tax collections, more than 85%. And then lastly, in the high level overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about star bond districts. Officially in statute, they're called tourism improvement districts and are located in Chapter 271A of the NRS. But these are the provisions that govern star bonds, otherwise known as sales tax anticipated revenue bonds. This policy was created by the legislature in Senate Bill 306 of the 2005 session. And basically, what this law allows is a city or county can create a district that is able to finance certain tourism projects based on a pledge of sales tax revenues that are generated within the district. So under current law, up to 75% of the proceeds from the state 2% rate, BCCRT and SCCRT that are generated within the district can be pledged to the district. If the district was created before July 1st, 2013, Up to 75% of the LSST that is generated within the district can be pledged as well. Senate Bill 406 of the 2013 session eliminated the ability for LSST to be pledged in any district created or revised on or after July 1st, 2013. So any brand new districts that have been created, and there have been several recently, they can only pledge the 2%, the BCCRT, and the SCCRT. The next slide is talking about some of the things that have to happen with respect to the STAR bond districts. The big one being is the Department of Taxation's requirement to distribute the pledged revenues to the municipality for up to 20 years after the creation of the district. However, if a district received no distributions for the first 5 full fiscal years after its creation, Senate Bill 310 of the 2015 session authorized the length of that distribution by the Department of Taxation to go out for another 5 years. So generally speaking, STAR bonds districts last for 20 years. Unless they didn't do anything for the first 5 years, in which case that is extended by another 5 years to up to 25. There are several other conditions that have to be met, such as geographic restrictions. If it's a city creating the district, it has to be entirely within the city. If it's county creating the district, it has to be entirely within the county, but outside of any cities. There can't be any retailers within the district within 120 days of the adoption of the ordinance. And then there are restrictions on businesses that close and relocate within the district within a 3-mile radius of that district. And then other things relating to bonding and annual reporting that must be sent to LCB. There are currently 8 STAR bond districts that receive revenue distributions. The first 2 were in Washoe County, Cabela's and Legends in September of 2006 and July of 2007, respectively. The Freight House District, which is in the eastern part of downtown Reno, around the bowling stadium and Greater Nevada Field, home of the Reno Aces, that was created in September of 2009. Tessera in the northern part of downtown Reno was also created by the city of Reno at the same time, September of 2009. That primarily houses office space for Apple, and they are the primary benefit of that district. And then there are 4 that were subsequently created in Clark County. 4th Street and Stewart Avenue was created by the city of Las Vegas in September of 2009. Those are parcels and other improvements around the Smith Center for the Performing Arts, with the exception of the Lou Ruvo Center for Brain Health, which is on the southwest corner just outside that district. Symphony Park was created in June of 2014. I'm sorry, that 4th Street and Stewart Avenue is the Mob Museum. Symphony Park is the Smith Center for the Performing Arts. I apologize. And that Symphony Park was created in June of 2014. And the 2 most recent ones are right in the same geographic area. Area 15 was created in October of 2019. That's just to the west of I-15, just off of Rancho. And then New Vegas Immersive was created in August of 2024. That is 36 acres just to the north of Area 15, which includes the new Universal Horror Unleashed. And so those are the 8 districts that are eligible to receive pledge revenues at this time. And Madam Chair, it looks like you have a question.
Me and a simple back as well. Where's the new immersive?
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. New Vegas Immersive there are 36 acres that are just to the north of Area 15. It's on Rancho, so just on the west side of I-15. Most of the parcels right now are vacant to my understanding, but I do know that the Universal Horror Unleashed facility, which just opened fairly recently, is located there.
So Symphony Park used STAR bonds. Did they use STAR bonds to build those apartments and the hotel?
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. To my understanding, the STAR bond proceeds, and this is just my recollection of reading the annual reports from the city of Las Vegas and the detail that they have is that the pledged revenues from Symphony Park were used for parking garages and other improvements, sidewalks and so on, that are able to be used by patrons of the Smith Center and the Lou Ruvo Institute for Brain Health. I don't know if any of the apartments or anything that is there, any of the proceeds go to that. My understanding, it's just those improvements that I mentioned.
Okay, is that something we can, I want to know, is this something we can find out, like, I mean, because I think I've asked about this. First of all, I didn't know it was a star bond. I always thought it was an RDA, but they've said that, it wasn't built with RDA funds, but I don't know that to be true. But I'm wondering like how those two other pieces were built and what were they built with?
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. I will have to reach out or get information from the city of Las Vegas on that with respect to the usage of.
So when you reach out, can you also ask them like to supply the minutes on the day that the hotel and apartments were approved as backup?
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record, we will make that request.
Okay, thank you.
So that was kind of the high level overview of the sales and use tax, getting a little bit into the weeds perhaps on C-tax and star bonds, but we thought it was good information. And a lot of this we put together because we haven't put together a history in a lot of detail like this. So hopefully as time progresses, this is something we can update and make available to the legislature and the public. In terms of when we look at sales and use tax as your forecasters for the Economic Forum and as your economists, we look at collections and we look at taxable sales. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail. Again, not too much there. First is a discussion of taxable sales. And so taxable sales are generally the dollar amount of retail sales of tangible personal property that are subject to the sales and use tax. That term taxable sales is not defined in statute, but it is something that we use. It's something the Department of Taxation uses, and it's derived from the statutory definitions of gross receipts, retail sale, and sales price in the Sales and Use Tax Act. So we impose the sales and use tax on tangible personal property that is made for any purpose other than resale in the regular course of business. And you can see the definitions of gross receipts, retail sale, and sales price that are listed there. And so when you put all of those things together, basically whatever a business reports as this is what we sold the items for, and then those are all aggregated and it gets reported by the Department of Taxation as taxable sales. So when we look at historical taxable sales, at least going back to the year 2000, so we have two lines here. The blue line is what the Department of Taxation is actually reporting in their statistics, and then the red line is inflation adjusting that back to $2,000, to FY 2000 year dollars. So you can see they start at the same point, and then we get to the end, and there's a distinct convergence. But that number, the red line number, is the one we look at, is how is it holding compared to inflation? And actually, this is one that does quite well because it's based on a percentage of the sales price. So as our population increases, as we have more visitors, as prices go up, we're going to get this bump in the taxable sales that you can see in the blue line. But then when you take inflation into account, normally you might expect that it would stay flat or go down, and we see that in a lot of taxes, but not with the sales and use tax. This one actually performs quite well compared to inflation, and a lot of it are those demographic changes, both in population and in visitors. So when you look at taxable sales per capita, so divided by the Nevada population, that is where it changes a little bit. The amount that every Nevadan is spending in terms of taxable sales, or the taxable sales per person, has increased, and it's almost doubled in the last 24 years. This is going back to FY 2024. But then when you look at it in inflation adjusted dollars, it's more or less flat. So when you start looking at the population growth and start accounting for that, we're kind of more or less at the same level than we were before. In terms of our largest taxable sales sectors for FY 2025, you can see that food services and drinking places is by far number one. It makes up 14.8 billion, or approximately 16.9% of the total FY 25 taxable sales of approximately $87.8 billion. And then you go all the way down to the 15th one, which is merchant wholesalers and non-durable goods, which is around 1.14 billion, or 1.3% of total taxable sales. But a lot of what we see in these top 15 are based on tourism. So food services and drinking places, food and beverage retailers, and accommodation. Those three are big drivers of the tourist-based economy. But again, they're not the only ones. General merchandise retailers, which is going to include online retailers, is number 2, and that is 13.1 billion of taxable sales, or 14.9%. Motor vehicles and parts dealers, the third one listed there, is 10.6%, or $9.3 billion. Those top three make up 42.4%. When you add in the merchant wholesalers and durable goods, that brings us over 50% of taxable sales. These top 15 make up 83.3% of Nevada's taxable sales for FY 2025. And then finally, I have some statistics on the actual sales and use tax collections for FY 2025 broken out by each of the rates. So you can see the state general fund distribution for the 2%, as well as the Star Bond District distributions. Then the same thing for the LSST, which includes the state general fund, the state education fund, and Star Bond districts. Then the BCCRT, and then on the next page, the SCCRT, local option taxes, and then the total collections for all rates. The sales tax sales and use tax throughout Nevada during FY 25 generated approximately $7.2 billion, but in every instance, FY 25 collections were lower than FY 24.
So on the 20% decrease for Star Bonds, is that because they haven't adjusted the boundaries, expanded the boundaries? I mean, it's historically it started off weak, right? Like it never really produced what it was supposed to produce. But now that there is certain developments, I don't know if that was included, that hockey stadium that's going to be built by that hotel. Is that, like, do they have the capacity to, I mean, clearly they do. They can rearrange their boundaries. But it's a consistent decrease.
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. Because these are individual districts with individual retailers or taxable activity happening in each one, we would potentially have to go and look at each of the districts, and perhaps even each of the retailers within the district, to see kind of what's driving that. You mentioned the hockey arena, or the arena that's being built at the Grand Sierra Resort in Reno. That is not part of a Star Bond district at this time. I believe it is part of one of their RDAs, but it's not part of a Star Bond district. But in terms of that decrease, there are any numbers of factors that could be happening within each of those individual districts, or even within each of the businesses within those districts, that would prompt that. But it is something that we could look into to see if there's anything that we could glean from it.
Okay. And is the LSST drop, do you know what that's related to, or is that related to the fact that it's still allowed to be pledged one time for economic development what is it? Why is it do you know why that decrease is there for LSST?
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. The LSST drop is just symptomatic of the sales tax in general. The last fiscal year collections were fairly weak compared to FY 2024. And the LSST is no exception to that. There's no other factor that I can point to other than taxable sales were weak, collections were weak, due to decreased visitor activity and any other number of factors.
And then if we look at page 19, where you have the bar graph, and when we look at merchant wholesalers and durable goods, I mean, and also the sporting goods, musical instrument, books, and miscellaneous. I mean, could one make the argument that there is a shift in product lines because they are now intangible in an intangible form and not being captured?
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record, that certainly could be the case, that we could be seeing potential decreases in those. And I can't actually tell you whether those are decreasing or not, but you are correct that there can be some shifts in some of these categories. One of the big shifts actually could be you could move some of those, like the clothing, accessory, shoe, and jewelry retailers out of that category, and they could actually be moving to general merchandise retailers, because more and more people, instead of going to the mall and buying whatever they're going to buy at the mall, could be going to Amazon and buying it online, and that would probably show up in general merchandise retailers. But then you're absolutely correct. So based on the shift in how products are consumed, and the good example will be the next agenda item dealing with digital goods. A lot of things that you previously would have gone to the record store or the bookstore to purchase are now just being downloaded and are not subject to the sale.
So the general merchandise retailer is holding at the second largest because of, well, one could argue because of the marketplace facilitator, because we shifted to try to make sure we were capturing online retailers where they were selling goods.
That is correct, Madam Chair. Michael Nakamoto for the record. Because of the actions that were taken by the state during the 2010s, in response to several court cases, which I'll talk about a little later in the presentation, as well as the marketplace facilitator bill that was passed in 2019. That is picking up a lot of taxable sales, many of which are probably flowing into that general merchandise retailers category as online sales.
So can I ask this though, because when you look at the food and beverage retailers, when we've had this conversation, I think I know in prior like legislative hearings, we've asked Department of Tax, like, is DoorDash and Uber Eats and all of these captured in the marketplace facilitator? And they said yes. But if that's true, then the food beverage should also be a little bit stronger if folks are doing more delivery on an online platform rather than physically going. I mean, shouldn't that be a little bit higher? How can we examine that and try to determine, like, are we truly getting all of the platforms within the marketplace facilitator, I guess, language that's out there? Because it's not like people stop eating out. They're actually just saying, I want it this way, right? And then wouldn't the same thing apply for an Instacart, right?
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. My understanding of those kinds of platforms is the same as yours, is that they are picked up and sales tax is being collected. I know, for example, if I were to order something from DoorDash, I can see a line there that says what the sales tax that is collected. And that certainly is a portion of what's going on with food services and drinking places. But I think the big driver of that category is tourist activity, because for all the people, the residents may order things via Grubhub, Uber Eats, DoorDash, but you still have people who are visiting Las Vegas or Reno that may not be having DoorDash delivered to their hotel. They might be going to any number of restaurants or fine eating establishments in the Las Vegas Valley or anywhere else in the state. That one kind of ebbs and flows, I think, a little bit with the tourist activity. But again, it's something that we'll have to look at. And one of the things that I will observe, though, is the reason why we have kind of a break in a lot of the taxable sales sectors. I didn't put together an FY25 to FY24 comparison of taxable sales because of the Mint switchover, which changed the taxable sales series. We're working with the Department of Taxation right now to kind of get an apples to apples comparison as far back as we can. But a lot of the stats that we have up to FY 2024 aren't really comparable anymore because of that switchover and the way that they're reporting. But that's something that we're working with the department on. But again, you make valid observations, Madam Chair. There are a lot of things in the economy that are different now than when the sales and use tax was put into place in 1955. And that'll be part of the discussion a little bit later. But you're right, the delivery platforms, online retail, those are all symptomatic of a bigger issue with this tax.
Thank you.
So moving on to slide 22, this is the same comparison for state sales and use tax collections for the general fund, both in actual and inflation adjusted dollars. And you can see inflation adjusted is the one that we look at probably more than the actual collections, because even though actual collections have nearly doubled in the last 25 years, over the last 25 years, when you inflation adjust it, there is some growth, but then you can see that there are some peaks and valleys in that inflation adjusted growth. Especially there was a big run up to 2007, and then it fell off as part of the Great Recession. Then there was a slight run up during the recovery up until 2020, which was the pandemic. And then after that, it shot back up, but you can see it falling back a little bit. And so one of the things that I think I take away from this is this one actually perhaps is a little bit of an indicator about how the economy is doing. So when the inflation adjusted tax collections fall, you can see maybe there's a little bit of weakness or softness in the economy. And then when you look at it per capita, you get a similar result, but actually the one thing that is really striking about the inflation adjusted per capita is when you figure in population, we're actually lower in FY 2025 than we were back in FY 2000. And this is inflation adjusted per person. And then lastly, we have total 2% sales and use tax collections as a percentage of the total general fund. You can see in FY 2000, it started at about 35%. We're closer to 30% now. There was a big run up during the Great Recession, but then in FY 2004, it fell due to the imposition of the live entertainment tax and the modified business tax. And then it kind of fell off a cliff during the Great Recession, came back up during the recovery. And then in 2016, it fell again after the imposition of the commerce tax and increases to the MBT, which kind of de-emphasized the role of the sales tax. And then it grew and kind of has been sitting in this 30-ish% range for the last, about 6 fiscal years or so. So the next part of the presentation, Madam Chair, it would not be a presentation that I'm doing without a little bit of background and history. And I actually have fun with these, so I'll go through this as quickly as possible. So sales and use taxes are not new to the United States or even to the civilized world as we know it today. Excise taxes on certain commodities such as oil, cooking oils were used in ancient Egypt and ancient Greece. And then the first general sales tax was used by the Roman Empire around 6 CE. That 1% rate was used to support the Roman army. The Emperor Augustus thought it was a good idea. The rest of the populace really didn't. Around 17 CE, the Emperor Tiberius halved the rate, and then the Emperor Caligula got rid of the rate around 38 CE. But it kind of stuck. And so they became common use in Europe and elsewhere around the world for hundreds of years. It didn't really come into play, at least as a general concept in the United States, until the year 1930. The United States has historically had excise taxes on various products. In fact, during the Civil War, there's an argument that's been made that there was, to fund the war, they had so many different excise taxes, it might have well has been a general sales tax. But the first general sales taxes, as we knew them or know them today, were put into place in 1930 by Kentucky and Mississippi. And this was as a result of the Great Depression. Kentucky thought it was a really bad idea. They abolished it in 1936 and then re-restored it back in 1960. But the Great Depression was a driver of sales taxes throughout the 1930s. So by 1933, you had 13 other states that are listed there that had imposed their own taxes. And then in 1940, there were a total of 23 states, as well as the territory of Hawaii, that had their own sales and use taxes. And then 4 other states, Connecticut, Maryland, Rhode Island, and Tennessee, would add one in 1947, which brings us forward to Nevada in 1947. So on the second day of the 43rd legislative session, January 21st, 1947, Governor Vale Pittman gave a state of the state address to a joint session of the legislature. And so in Nevada, right at that exact moment, there was an increased demand in government services. People were coming back from the war, starting their families, and they wanted things. Not only they wanted to consume things, which was driving up prices, but they were also consuming government services. And so the legislature was faced with a potential budget deficit of approximately $1 million. So Governor Pittman, in that address, requested the legislature several things of the legislature. And first was to maintain the state's property tax rate, which was at the time 64 cents per $100 of assessed value. Many local governments, as I had previously mentioned, were at the $5 constitutional limit. And so if the state raised their rates, the local governments would have to reduce theirs and have to reduce their services, and Governor Pittman didn't want to do that. He asked for potential increases to the state gaming and liquor taxes, the imposition of taxes on cigarettes and tobacco, which were at the time were not taxed. And then he finally asked for the legislature to study the determination of the feasibility of imposing sales and income taxes. At this point, this had never been discussed in Nevada. When even through the Great Depression, you go back and look at state of the state addresses, and governors weren't asking about sales or income taxes. They were focused primarily on property taxes, and really that was about it. They would put taxes on gaming and do some other things, but sales and income taxes were just off the table. Basically, Governor Pittman noted, his quote there from the state address was, "We hate these taxes, but we have services that we need to fund, and so I ask you to at least look at them." The legislature didn't do anything regarding sales or income taxes. They would increase the liquor tax. They would impose a $3 state marriage license fee in 2 pieces of legislation that are listed there. But they really didn't talk about sales taxes other than 2 bills that were introduced. So Assembly Bill 251 during that 1947 session was sponsored by Assembly Member Albert McKenzie from Yerington. The bill was introduced on March 11th and referred to the Assembly Ways and Means Committee and never got a hearing. The bill that did get hearings was Senate Bill 235, which was sponsored by Senator Charles Baker from here in Las Vegas. It would have authorized counties with a population of 15,000 or more, Clark and Washoe counties at the time, to enact an ordinance imposing a tax upon the sale of articles sold within said counties at a rate not to exceed 2%. The bill was introduced on March 15th and referred to the Joint Select Committee of the senators from Clark and Washoe counties. Interesting committee name. The bill was amended by the committee, passed on March 18th. The Senate approved the bill on March 19th. The Assembly Select Committee of the Clark County Delegation was referred the bill in the Assembly. They passed it on March 20th. The bill went to second reading and did not receive a vote in the Assembly. March 20th was the last day of the session. They did not waive the rules and make this an emergency measure, so it died on the chief clerk's desk. Which brings us forward to November 7th of 1947. And I'm going to read what this says and wrap it around your mind, because when Ms. Owens, who put this slide together, and I'm appreciative to all of my staff for their assistance in this, but she put this in and it makes no sense when you read it. On November 7th, 1947, the Legislative Council Bureau ordered the Legislative Council to conduct a comprehensive study of sales taxes. So basically, somebody at LCB told the Legislative Council to do something. That's not how things work, at least the way that I look at it. But at the time, LCB was made up of legislators and legislators only. When it was created in 1945, it had one member of the Assembly, one member of the Senate, and the governor. In 1947, they amended it, so it was two legislators, one from each party, one from each house, and then they were directing their staff, which was the Legislative Council, which was created by the bill that created the LCB, to do this study. And so the study that was put out by J.E. Springmeyer, who was the Legislative Counsel at the time, was called the Survey of Sales Taxes Applicable to Nevada. It was published by our state printing office in May of 1948, and had a compare and went through all of the permutations. So it had sales and use tax laws in the US, Canada, Australia, and Great Britain, a discussion of various types of taxes that could be imposed, whether it's a gross receipts tax, a manufacturer's tax, a retail tax, a wholesale tax, use taxes, and so on and so forth. There was a discussion of exemptions to the taxes that could be considered. And then finally, there were administrative issues that have been encountered by state regulators who have their own sales taxes at the time. At the time, again, there were more than half of the states had one. So the published study reached several conclusions. First, it said that the retail sales tax would be more preferable than a gross receipts tax or taxes at other levels of production, because it would generate more revenue. It would reduce the effects of pyramiding, things that get discussed now about gross receipts taxes. It would be easier to determine the activities that are or are not taxable than other taxes. And they pointed to manufacturing as a good example, because it would be difficult to determine what was manufacturing and what wasn't. And then it would be easier to determine the tax base for the calculation of the tax due. Basically, the sales price is what you pay, as opposed to a wholesale or a manufacturer's tax. There are other things that could be factored in. The retail sales tax could be used to tax the purchase of both goods and services. And then with the retail sales tax, you could pair a use tax along with it to capture all of the out-of-state transactions that would not be subject to the state sales tax. They did note some limitations of the retail sales tax, some of which get discussed today. The first one is that it was probably the most difficult to administer out of all of the options for state government, because you had a huge, potentially large amount of taxpayers, and there were concerns that businesses would not keep adequate records. Retail sales taxes could cause some taxpayers to pay a larger percentage of their expenditures on the tax than other taxpayers. And this is especially true of persons who have lower incomes. Basically, this says the sales tax is regressive. It is an argument that we hear today. It is an argument, as your economists, that we generally subscribe to. People with lower incomes tend to spend a higher percentage of their income on the sales tax than people with larger incomes. If the tax rate is low, and we're talking at a time where sales taxes were 1%, 2%, 3%, there may be issues collecting the tax when the tax calculated due is a fraction of a cent. So if you're purchasing something that is 10 cents and the sales tax rate is 0.1%, how are you going to collect 0.1 cent? There were ways that states addressed this. They issued tokens to people that people could basically use to pay that. There were also brackets that were created so that you didn't pay up to a certain percent or a certain cost, and then above that, within a certain range, you paid 1 cent, and then 2 cents, and then 3 cents, and so on. There were ways that got addressed. And then finally, they noted that some transactions needed to be exempt, such as those that were prohibited to be taxed under state or federal law, but any exemptions to the tax had the potential of complicating the administration of the tax. And so the last pages of the study featured model language for a Sales and Use Tax Act that could be used by Nevada, which had the following features. And basically, it was a 1% tax upon the sale of use of tangible personal property, just goods, not services, that would become effective on July 1st, 1949. The taxes would be paid to the Nevada Tax Commission on a quarterly basis, and then you could see a list of exemptions that were there. Anything that the state or federal government or the state was prohibited from taxing under state or federal law, the sale of tangible personal property to federal, state, or local governments, the sale of gold or silver bullion, the sale or use of motor vehicle fuel, the sale of or use of wine, beer, or liquor, the sale or use of cigarettes, and then on and on for livestock feed, fertilizer, meals served at schools or other educational facilities. They had this big thing about containers, either non-returnable or returnable under certain circumstances, and so on. The model language from the study was actually used for 2 different bills during the 1949 session, and obviously neither bill passed. One was Assembly Bill 305, sponsored by the Assembly Speaker, Peter Burke from Sparks. He introduced the bill on March 1st. It was tabled, withdrawn from the table on March 10th, and referred to the Joint Assembly Committee on Ways and Means and Taxation. It was passed from committee on March 17th, declared an emergency measure, and then it failed on general file after an attempt to re-refer it to another committee. The same bill was brought by Senator John Murray of Eureka as SB 179. It was referred to the Senate Finance Committee on March 8th. It was moved from the committee without recommendation on March 17th, which was, for that session, the last day of the session, declared an emergency measure, placed on general file, and failed in the Senate vote. Neither house was particularly thrilled about passing a sales tax bill in 1949. They had also considered another bill to authorize a local sales tax, and this time, SB 233, which was sponsored by Francis Loomis of Reno, would have allowed any county commission to impose a sales tax rate of up to 2%. So on March 17th, on that last day of session, it was introduced, referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee, amended and passed, declared an emergency measure, amended and passed by the Senate, referred straight to the Assembly, declared an emergency measure, and because it was declared an emergency measure, went straight to general file. It passed committees and was rejected by the Assembly. So there were efforts as a result of Governor Pittman wanting to study the Sales and Use Tax Act, and for a couple of sessions, they tried and failed. In 1951 or 1953, there were no efforts to impose a sales and use tax in Nevada. Basically, Governor Charles Russell thought that the level of taxes in the state were sufficient for a balanced budget. So let's fast forward to 1955. K-12 education required anywhere between $9.5 and $13.3 million of additional revenue during that biennium. In fact, there was a study that had been put out by the George Peabody College. Their report on public education said that number should actually be higher and close to $16.8 million. So that was the year that they started looking for revenue for K-12 education. And so the Sales and Use Tax Act of 1955, what we know today as our sales and use tax, was passed by the legislature in Senate Bill 171. And as I had previously noted, there was a petition that was brought for a public referendum on that. At least 10% of the voters filed a petition, signed it, and said, we want to vote on this. And so question 8 on the 1956 general election in November of 1956 asked whether the legislature or whether the voters approved or disapproved of Senate Bill 171, and the voters of the state approved it by about a 2/3 to 1/3 margin. So it was fairly convincing that the sales tax should stay. But as a result of that vote, the legislature does not have the ability to amend the Sales and Use Tax Act without voter approval. And so then any changes have had to have happened between now and then, or then and now, based on the ballot. So when you look at the original exemptions to the sales and use tax, you had a number of things that were listed. And a lot of what is in here was from that model legislation. So the proceeds of mines is kind of the analogy to that gold or silver bullion, but those are subject to the tax on net proceeds of minerals. Then you have fuels, livestock feed, meals served to students at private schools. The container one, gas, electricity, materials for domestic heating, so on and so forth. Newspapers and periodicals and their ingredients and components is one that was not in that, but it was added to the Sales and Use Tax Act, and so on and so forth. But as I noted, there is a requirement that voters approve amendments to the Sales and Use Tax Act. And so the next part of this is going through a list of some of those amendments, as well as a few that we threw in there that were proposed but failed. And so the first one that we have listed was one that failed, and that was question 1 from the June 1963 special election that proposed to increase the sales and use tax rate from 2% to 3%, which failed. In 1970, there was a ballot question, question 8, which provided for the exemption of prescription medicines from the tax, and also removed the exemption for periodicals that was put into place in 1955. In 1979, there was question 1 that's provided for the exemption of food for human consumption. So if you go to the grocery store and purchase your groceries, as long as it's not prepared food, those are exempt from the sales tax. That was supplemented by a constitutional amendment in 1984. So under the Constitution now, that it basically reinforces what the Sales and Use Tax Act already said. Most significantly, or perhaps more significantly though, is that question 1 repealed certain sections of the Sales and Use Tax Act and restored certain administrative provisions of the tax to legislative control. So there are portions of Chapter 372 of the NRS that are able, for the legislature is able to amend without voter approval. They're outside of the Sales and Use Tax Act as a result of this ballot question, do not require voter approval. But when it gets to the rates, the exemptions, and so on, those are still within the Sales and Use Tax Act and require voter approval. In 1986, there were 3 ballot questions relating to the sales and tax exemptions. First was an exemption of aircraft and major aircraft components sold or scheduled or to scheduled air carriers based in Nevada. Question 6, remove the exemption for federal government contractors, and then specified that the use tax applies to property purchased out of state if it would have been a taxable sale had it occurred within the state. So if Assembly Member, go on.
If I may, Chair, question. So I'm looking at this exemption for sales for contractors to construct and improve real property. Does that still stand as an exemption?
Assembly Member Gallant, Michael Nakamoto for the record. I'm going to have to look into that for you to see if that was removed at some point.
Okay.
It might have been something that we missed.
Okay. I would, yes, if you could
Okay.
follow up with me on that.
Sounds
great. Thank you.
So for question 6, the use tax applying to out-of-state purchases. So basically, the good example that I like to use, because I live in Reno and that's closer to the Oregon border than Las Vegas is, obviously. If I go to Oregon and purchase something that doesn't have sales tax attached to it because Oregon doesn't have a sales tax, I'm responsible for paying the use tax. And so question 6 from 1986 clarified that that is what the law means. And then question 8 provided for an exemption of prosthetic devices, appliances, or supplies relating to an ostomy and products for hemodialysis. Question 5 of the 1988 general election provided for an exemption for personal property donated or loaned to tax-exempt organizations, and then as well as an exemption of 40% of the sales price of a new manufactured or mobile home and the total sales price of a manufactured or mobile home, and that was question 6. In 1990, there was question 3, which provided an exemption for textbooks that were sold by the University of Nevada system, which we know as NSHE, or the Nevada System of Higher Education. Question 13 from 1996 provided for an exemption of orthotic appliances, ambulatory casts, other supports, splints, bands, bandages, pads, compresses, and so on. And then question 14 of the 1996 general election provided for the exemption of items sold by nonprofit organizations created for religious, charitable, or education purposes. And so up to that point, the exemption related to those organizations was for the merchandise that they purchased. This also now applies to any merchandise that they sell. So if one of these organizations, for example, has a thrift store and you go buy something from it, whatever you purchase from them is exempt from the sales tax. In 2004, as a means to come into compliance with the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement, which I'll talk about a little bit later, question 8 proposed to exempt a number of items from the state 2% rate that were already exempt from the LSST, BCCRT, SCCRT, and local option taxes. The initiative failed, and as a result of the initiative, the exemptions for all of those other rates, those were repealed because the exemptions have to apply under SUDA's rules to all portions of the rate and not just some portions of the rate. Question 8 in 2006 provided for the exemption of the value of any used vehicle taken in trade for the purchase of another vehicle, and then an exemption for farm machinery and equipment. Those were actually 2 of the items on the list in 2004 that were rejected. These were added back in 2006. In 2010, question 3 proposed the legislature to proposed to allow the legislature to amend or repeal any provision of the Sales and Use Tax Act of 1955 only if necessary to resolve a conflict with any federal law or interstate agreement for the administration, collection, or enforcement of sales and use taxes. This failed as well, and this was also part of the coming into compliance with SUDA, or at least an attempt to. And then 2016 and 2018, there was question 4, which would have which amended Article 10 of the Nevada Constitution to provide for exemptions for durable medical equipment, oxygen delivery equipment, and mobility enhancing equipment. Those passed in both elections, and as a result, Senate Bill 447 in 2019 added this exemption to the Sales and Use Tax Act. That did not need voter approval because the voters had already approved it through the Constitution. And then the most recently in 2018 and 2024, there were exemptions passed for feminine hygiene products and diapers. In 2021, the legislature approved Senate Bill 440, which provided a Sales and Use Tax Act or exemption valid through June 30th, 2031 for purchases of tangible personal property made by certain members of the Nevada National Guard and their qualifying relatives when the purchase occurs on Nevada Day or the immediately following Saturday or Sunday. So this is what we call as the National Guard sales tax holiday. After the law took effect, it was determined that the bill conflicted with Section 322 of the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement, or SUTA, which has 4 requirements for temporary sales tax exemptions or sales tax holidays. Senate Bill 440 violated 2 of those requirements because it applied an entity-based exemption and required sellers to obtain a letter of exemption from purchasers for qualifying purchases. So in 2023, the legislature came back and passed Senate Bill 50 to address the SUTA compliance issues and revise the National Guard sales tax holiday to require retailers to collect sales tax at the time of purchase. And then an eligible member of the Nevada National Guard or their qualifying relatives can then apply for a refund request to the Department of Taxation. And if it is determined they are eligible, that is, they are a qualifying Guard member or a relative, and that they made the purchase on the Nevada Day weekend, they would get a reimbursement for the tax paid. And so in the 3 fiscal years since this incarnation of the program was put into place, you can see the amount of tax that was refunded, as well as the number of claims that were either partially or fully approved. Madam Chair, are there any questions up to this point?
Members, are there any questions up to this point? Up north? No? So, yeah, you probably should be, we need to do a petition for you to teach tax law history in Nevada. I'm just saying, this should happen. Or just a tax history class, try to get you over at UNR.
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto, for the record, at least his presentation is not 4 hours long like the C-Tax one. So next I'm going to move on to probably the biggest development as it pertains to the Sales and Use Tax Act within the last 60 years, and especially within the last decade, and that deals with remote sellers and marketplace facilitators.
So for that one, can we just start at like page 53?
I can do
It's
that.
page 125, but it's slide 53. I have a history.
If I can just, I'll basically go through the slides very quickly and just kind of give a high level overview because the whole thing really sets up. So
Okay.
the gist of this is that the discussion of sales tax on interstate commerce or for out-of-state sales is not a new discussion. There are 3 Supreme Court cases in the 40s, 50s, and 60s dealing with traveling salesmen going from one state to another, trying to collect the sales tax or a use tax. And those, the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And then in the 60s, the first mail order case came where a Missouri company, National Bellis Hess, was trying to collect the Illinois wanted National Bellis Hess to collect their sales or use tax. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And so there were tests to that. And the biggest test came in the late 1980s in North Dakota, where they put a test saying that if you solicited at least 3 transactions within the state of North Dakota, you had to collect the North Dakota use tax. So Quill Corporation, which is an office supply company now owned by Staples, sued North Dakota based on this, saying that, you know, the National Bellis Hess case and these previous cases applied. And basically the Supreme Court said, yes, you can't collect the sales and use tax, but the issue is ultimately the Dormant Commerce Clause, which basically the Dormant Commerce Clause, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, says that you cannot violate interstate commerce unless Congress says it's okay. And so then that began this push especially from states, for Congress to act and create some sort of legislation that would allow retailers to collect sales taxes on their out-of-state purchases or something to that effect. And so that was the genesis of the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement, otherwise known as SUTA. So all of these states got together and put together this list of common rules, things that they needed to do to make things as standardized as possible, to make it as easy as possible for retailers to go through and collect the sales tax if Congress were to do something about it. And so there was this big push to have Congress do something. Streamlined sales and use tax agreement came into being in March of 2000. Nevada passed legislation in 2001 to join SUTA, and they were accepted as a full member several years later after making various revisions to their law and so on and so forth. And despite all of that, Congress really didn't try to act on anything until July of 2010, where Congressman William Delahunt of Massachusetts introduced the Main Street Fairness Act in the House of Representatives, died without a hearing. The Marketplace Fairness Act, which was sponsored by Senator Michael Enzi of Wyoming, was introduced in the Senate in February of 2011. It died without a hearing. Both of these bills would have allowed SUTA member states to require all sellers that were not small seller or exempt under small seller provisions to collect and remit sales tax on remote sales into those states. And similar legislation would be introduced in Congress in 2013 on 3 occasions, and then in 2017, and none of these bills passed. So all the efforts of SUTA for Congress to do something, Congress tried and did not do anything. So that kind of left the states to do their own thing. And so on page 52 or slide 52 of the presentation is kind of where I'm going to start all of this. So on April 23rd, 2012, Governor Brian Sandoval announced an agreement with Amazon, who would collect and remit sales tax on Nevada transactions beginning on April 1st, 2014. And this was for Nevada kind of the door kicking open for the first time. Amazon was agreeing to collect and remit the sales tax for anything that they sold on, that they themselves sold on their platform into Nevada. They had an agreement with California as well to start collecting sales tax in September of 2012. Contingent on Congress not passing legislation dealing with online sales tax collections. So Nevada wasn't the only one. California and other states were involved in this as well. In the 2015 session, former Assembly member and current Clark County Commissioner Marilyn Kirkpatrick introduced Senate Bill or Assembly Bill 380, which created a rebuttable presumption that sales and use tax must be imposed, collected, and remitted by retailers located outside of the state under certain conditions. And the first one, it was that the retailer was part of a controlled group of entities that had a component member who had physical presence in Nevada, and the component member engages in certain activities in Nevada that relate to the ability of the retailer to make retail sales to Nevada residents, or if the retailer enters into an agreement with a Nevada resident where the resident receives some sort of commission or rebate from the retailer for clicking through a link on that person's website, what we call affiliate nexus. So they basically, because you had to have some sort of sufficient nexus, this was Nevada trying to find ways to create some sort of nexus that wasn't physical in and of itself, in that the retailer wasn't located here, but they were affiliated with or had components of their business located in Nevada. So the bill was passed by in the Assembly by 33-9, passed 20-0 in the Senate, and signed by Governor Sandoval on May 27th, 2015. The same year, the Supreme Court had made a ruling that basically changed all the landscape. I didn't get the chance to talk about all of those cases in great detail, but basically Direct Marketing Association versus Broll overturned a lot of them. So in 2010, Colorado had passed a law requiring out-of-state vendors to collect and provide information to Colorado residents regarding their total purchases so that they could determine their use tax liability. The Direct Marketing Association sued in the district court for the District of Colorado, challenging the law, and the court ruled in favor of the DMA based on the Quill decision, that this was them hindering the interstate commerce. The 10th Circuit Appeals Court reversed that decision, saying first that under federal law, the court did not have the jurisdiction over disputes relating to a state tax matter, and second, that the decision was in and of itself inappropriate because collecting information on taxes is not the same as collecting the taxes itself. So the DMA appealed to the Nevada or the U.S. Supreme Court, and in March of 2015, the court ruled unanimously to remand the case back to the appeals court, basically saying that that they didn't have jurisdiction either. So the appeals court ruled in favor of the state of Colorado, eventually noting that the law did not violate the Dormant Commerce Clause, and remanded it back to the district court. There were a number of appeals, and finally DMA and the state of Colorado settled. They agreed to provide the information and drop all of the lawsuits, and in exchange, Colorado waived all of the late penalties that applied for noncompliance. But what really came out of this case was a concurrent opinion written by Justice Anthony Kennedy, which basically said the landscape of sales with the internet is far different in 2015 than it was with simply mail order under Quill. And so because all of this has changed, he said that it was unwise to delay any longer a reconsideration of the court's holding in Quill. A case questionable even when decided, Quill now harms states to a degree far greater than could have been anticipated earlier. And so basically everybody looked at that and said, we need to do something. We need to get something in front of the Supreme Court, a test case to see if the Supreme Court would overturn Quill. So within 2 years, more than 20 states had brought a law that would require taxes to be collected from remote sellers, which brings us to South Dakota in March of 2016. They were one of the first to do it. They passed Senate Bill 106, which required sales tax to be collected and remitted by out-of-state vendors from purchases to be shipped within the state. The requirement only applied to retailers whose total South Dakota sales in a calendar year exceeded $100,000, or if the seller had 200 or more separate transactions in a calendar year. And basically, the legislative findings for that bill said, you can read what is on there, the urgent need for the Supreme Court. They were bringing this as a test case. They wanted somebody to sue so that the Supreme Court would get it in front of them. And that actually happened. So prior to the effective date of the bill, the state would send a notice of lawsuit to 4 out-of-state vendors who are not already collecting sales tax and whom the state believed would exceed those thresholds. One of the vendors, a firm called Systemax, complied with the law and began collecting sales tax from South Dakota residents, and then which made the lawsuit against them moot. Wayfair, Overstock, and Newegg, the other 3 vendors, refused to comply, citing the Quill decision, so the state sued them. The 6th Judicial District of South Dakota and the South Dakota Supreme Court ruled in favor of Wayfair and the other defendants, saying that Quill was still the law. So South Dakota appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. They filed their petitions for a certiorari. I'm not a lawyer. And they had their various arguments that they made there. The National Retail Federation, 40 other states joined in that petition, and the Trump administration also was in support of this petition. Newegg, Wayfair, and Overstock would file their own petition to deny writ, stating the unreasonable burden, the cost disadvantage for remote sellers because of shipping, and also the Quill decision said that only Congress could pass laws relating to the collection of tax on interstate commerce, not the states. So there were a bunch of amicus briefs filed in opposition of the writ, including online retailers. Supreme Court decided they would hear the case in January of 2018, with oral arguments occurring on April 17th. And on June 24th, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state of South Dakota in a 5-4 decision, basically saying Justice Kennedy, writing the majority opinion, kind of backing up what he had written in the previous case, saying that the physical presence standard in Quill was, quote, unsound and incorrect. It overturned both that decision as well as portions of the National Hess case that I previously mentioned that had not been overturned by Quill. Basically, National Bellis Hess said that it was a violation of interstate commerce. Quill said, no, it's not. It's a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause, which kind of overturned National Bellis Hess. There was a dissenting opinion by Chief Justice Roberts that agreed that certain decisions that were made were wrongly decided, but it was more appropriate for Congress to act than for the court to do that. Regardless, the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of South Dakota, and as a result, by the end of 2018, more than 30 states had enacted their own laws or regulations requiring sales tax to be collected on remote sales. And again, most following the South Dakota model because that is the one that the Supreme Court ruled on. Nevada is one of those states. The state of Nevada began requiring remote sellers to collect sales tax effective October 1st, 2018. The regulation defining this and allowing for this was approved by the Legislative Commission's subcommittee to review regulations on September 27th. So they had a pretty quick turnaround time. So remote sellers are required under Nevada law to register and collect sales tax if they meet the $100,000 of retail sales or 200 or more separate transactions into Nevada, the South Dakota standard. If a purchase is made from a remote seller that does not meet these thresholds and the sales tax is not collected, the purchaser still has to remit the use tax to the Department of Taxation under current law. And then that brings us lastly to marketplace facilitators. This was a bill that was brought by the chair when she was in the Assembly back in 2019. Assembly Bill 445 required certain online marketplace facilitators to collect and remit sales and use tax on behalf of sellers whose goods are sold through their platforms. So it's not the platform that's selling it to you, it's somebody who uses the platform. eBay is a good example of that. So effective October 1st, 2019, a marketplace facilitator must collect and remit sales tax if during the current or immediately preceding calendar year, the facilitator has more than $100,000 of sales into the state of Nevada within the current or previous calendar year, or made or facilitated 200 or more transactions. So they are then responsible for collecting the sales tax as part of facilitating the transaction and then remitting it to the state. And so lastly, under other considerations and issues regarding the sales and use tax, this is just a bunch of stuff that really doesn't fit anywhere else. And so it's just some observations and things to bring up, some of which will actually be discussed in the next agenda item. So in terms of our sales tax compared to other states, our minimum sales tax rate of 6.85% is the 7th highest, according to the Tax Foundation, when they rank state sales tax rates. And among the 9 states with no personal income tax, which are Alaska, Florida, Nevada, New Hampshire, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Washington, and Wyoming, our sales tax is the 2nd highest out of all of those. And then the Federation of Tax Examiners in 2017 did a survey of service categories that are subject to tax in the state of Nevada or in the various states. We only tax 21 out of 176 identified service categories, which is 44th among the states that tax services in any form. So our most extensively taxed service sector, according to the survey, is admissions and amusements, which are not generally subject to the sales tax, rather the LET that we discussed in the previous meeting. In terms of economic dynamics of the sales tax, the state has made progress in diversifying its economy, and the big but that comes with that is that we still rely heavily on tourism. So when you go back and look at that slide and when you see food services and drinking places, those types of establishments at the top, that shows it's casinos, live entertainment, conventions, restaurants, and retail that remain key drivers of the state's activity. Tourism spending fluctuates with national economic conditions. Perhaps it's more sensitive to the economy than other things. So as a result, we experience more pronounced boom and bust cycles. And because we depend so heavily on sales and use tax, 30% of the state general fund, we have more vulnerability to swings in consumer spending. So we tie more to the economy and those up and down cycles, perhaps, than other states. Sales and use tax is generally considered regressive. One of the things that study noted back in 1948, because you have a heavier burden potentially on lower income households, which tend to spend a larger proportion of their earnings on taxable retail purchases than people with more money who may consume more services. Nevada does exempt a number of items: food, prescription medicines, certain medical equipment, feminine hygiene products, and so on, that do help in reducing that relative tax burden, because a lot of the money that a lot of people are spending most of their income on, or a big portion of their income on, are tax exempt, but it does not completely relieve the regressivity arguments or issues. And then finally, there are the related tax policy discussions that have been mentioned and will be mentioned today, dealing with shifts in consumer spending patterns and revenue stability and equity, taxing digital goods and services, and then things that we'll be talking about in future meetings, evaluating tax exemptions and abatements. So in terms of the goods and services argument, this is information that we got from the Bureau of Economic Analysis that basically shows the spending as a percentage of total spending on goods versus services. So you see goods is the blue line and services is the red line. And so historically, when you go back, and I started this at 1930 because that was the year of the first sales tax in the US, we were primarily a goods-based economy. That changed a little bit during the Great Depression. It dipped down and then came back up. But then you can see during the 40s and 50s and that we were predominantly goods. Up to as high as 60% of total consumer spending was on goods. That changed around 1970 when the lines crossed. And you could see that there's been a slow decline of goods compared to services. And so to the point where the consumption of goods is only about 30% of total personal consumption expenditures. With a sales tax base that is based on tangible personal property, on goods, this is symptomatic of an erosion of the base, especially when so much consumer spending escapes taxation because it is they are taxes on services that are not taxable in the state of Nevada. There have been a couple of bills to address this. One was Assembly Bill 569 of the 2011 session that proposed a 1% excise tax on the total amount charged for certain services in this state, with the proceeds deposited in the state general fund. There were certain exemptions that were provided for healthcare, daycare, funeral services, phone and internet, and personal care services. The bill got a bunch of hearings during May of 2011 in the Assembly Committee on Taxation. The chair and I may remember some of those, or we may be blocking them out. But in spite of those 6 hearings, no further action was taken on the bill. And then lastly, I will mention several bills dealing with the taxation of digital products. The first one was brought as Assembly Bill 447 in the 2019 session. And then the example that I have here is Senate Bill 396 from the 2023 session, which would have provided for an excise tax on the retail sale or use of specified digital products at a rate equal to the sales and use tax imposed in each county, and the proceeds distributed in the same manner and proportion as the sales and use tax rates that are there. The bill was heard in the Senate Revenue and Economic Development Committee on April 4th, and no further action was taken on the bill. The chair, because it was her bill, may be bringing something similar in the 2027 session. I do not know that for sure, though. You could ask her. And with that, that is the 71st and final slide. Are there any questions?
Members, any questions? So I know I have just, I guess they're more theoretical questions that I just want to put out there. So on slide 66, which is page 138, when we talk about the heavy dependence on sales and use tax, is there a possibility to try to balance a property tax change and at the same time, as a trade-off, lower the sales tax rate so that there is some stability in revenue, right? So, we hear the arguments that, it's too high. I mean, but it also is important to recognize that we're not an income tax state, right? So where other states are taxing income, we don't touch someone's income, right? But is there a scenario where we could create some kind of slide where it's like, all right, here is a shift in the property tax rate, whether or not it's on the depreciation or whatever, and then lowering the sales tax so that we can see stable revenue coming in that is growing, right? And not necessarily subject to so much volatility. Is that even a possibility?
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. That is something that we can look into putting something together. With respect to property tax, there are a lot of moving pieces that would need to be addressed, not the least of which are the partial abatements that restrict the growth of property tax bills that were approved by the legislature in the 2005 session, because that is kind of the mechanism that really is controlling what happens with property tax. You really have to address that and do something with that if you want to actually get some appreciable growth in property tax. But it is something that we can look at and maybe put together a few scenarios for consideration to see if there's something that we can come up with and give some options or ideas for the legislature to think about.
Yeah, because I want to start examining stuff not in isolation of each other, but in combination with each other. So we can get a fuller picture on, if two things occurred or four things occurred at the same time, do you then get a stable revenue structure for what is happening in Nevada, right? So that folks can feel, all right, well, yes, one thing happened over here, but it was lowered on this end. Because I don't think you can do one without doing something to another. And I also, the last and final question before we go to the next presentation is it even possible to relieve regressivity, right? So it's used as like this talking point that's just kind of thrown out that, you're going to hit lower income households, which is true. But also, what is supposed to be a part of our economic development strategy as a state is also supposed to be raising income and jobs for low income communities. It's supposed to, the idea of an economic development strategy is supposed to cross all economic tiers. And maybe should the question be, when we talk about regressivity of sales tax, also be looking at on the other side of the house is our economic development strategy that is supposed to bring jobs, actually doing the work of lifting low income communities and taking them from poverty to sustainability, right? And maybe that is also a side-by-side conversation that we should be having so that regressivity isn't thrown out as a way to kill a bill that is needed, right? When we know that there's economic development strategy that is not lifting folks out of poverty. And I think that is a broader discussion that I think we need to have, because I think we can make the argument that it is not doing that work, right? That although we are abating and giving, these wonderful large corporations access to Nevada, that in the I mean, I guess now we're 15 years into that economic development strategy since 2011, that we should ask and answer the question, did that economic development strategy of chasing the big fish change poverty for Nevadans? And if it did not, then there should be a re-examination along with the revenue question of regressivity, because I think that is the other side of the equation. And I don't think we've ever had that conversation on whether or not the economic development strategy of the state and the workforce strategy is changing the poverty of Nevadans. So I'll leave it there.
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. I don't know if I have an answer to all of your questions or statements. As a general observation, though, one of the ways that a lot of states address this, the regressivity issue, have a different tool set than Nevada does, in that they have a personal income tax. And so if the de-emphasis on a sales tax, which is considered more regressive, in favor of an income tax, especially if you set those brackets progressively so that the higher your marginal or your income goes, the higher your marginal rate goes, similar to what the federal government does. That is a way that states can often address the issues that you mentioned in terms of inequity or regressivity of the taxes. That is not something in the state's tool belt because of the constitutional prohibitions against a personal income tax. But it is something that I would just make as an observation. Is it the only answer that I could give you? I don't know. That's something we'd have to think about, and it is something we will think about. To see if we can come up with some ideas or options that could be considered.
Okay. So thank you for your presentation. I'm going to look into a UNR adjunct professor position for you. And then we're going to shift and go close agenda item number 5 and then go to agenda item number 6, which is on the overview and discussion of the taxation of digital goods. And I believe we have Ms. Jimenez from NCSL. Are you online? Zoom?
I am online.
We can't see.
Here we go.
Oh, okay, yeah. So are you ready to begin?
I am. I'm going to share my screen.
Okay.
If you could just confirm that you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having NCSL participate in this today. My name is Andrea Jimenez, and I'm a policy specialist with the organization. And I'm here to talk about the state taxation of digital goods. So we're going to start off with an overview of what they are, look a little bit at state tax policy and developments over the past 2 years, followed by some policy considerations and resources. So starting off with, what are digital goods? These are generally intangible products that are delivered or accessed electronically. And these are things like streaming services, ebooks, digital audio and video, and software. So part of what makes the taxation of digital products difficult is the differentiation between digital goods and digital services. So it's hard for states to define and classify goods and services for a couple of reasons. The first one, statutes vary quite widely, and they use inconsistent or outdated terminology, which is kind of expected considering these statutes are old and they have not quite adapted to all of the technology that has been developed in the last couple of decades. Then it's also pretty difficult to distinguish a digital product from an automated service, especially when you're thinking about things like cloud computing or software as a service. Then the taxability can also depend on how the product is delivered. So is it downloaded by the consumer or is it streamed? Then another consideration here is how the rights are conveyed, right? So do the users have permanent ownership or do they have temporary access to this product? All in all, there's really no uniformity in the treatment of digital goods and services, which has a pretty significant impact, especially on digital services. Again, like software as a service, streaming services, and cloud-based services. We can take a look here at a couple of different definitions from state to state. So if we take a look at California, there really isn't a specific definition for digital goods, but the state does consider pre-written software, for example, tangible personal property only if it's delivered physically. If it's delivered electronically, the software is not taxable. In Illinois, similarly, there's not a specific definition for digital goods, but pre-written software is considered tangible personal property, like in California, and it's taxed regardless of how it's delivered. Meanwhile, if it's custom software, that will not be taxed. And you can see here the other couple of states that those definitions vary. And to further underscore how widely this treatment varies from state to state, we can take a little bit of a deeper look here. You'll see that most states treat pre-written software as tangible personal property, and therefore it's taxable in most of these states. However, there are other states that do make a distinction when software is tangible versus when it's delivered electronically. And in these cases, they will only tax the tangible software. And then if you take a look at custom software, it's generally not taxed by states. There are, however, some exceptions, like in Mississippi and Tennessee. Both of these states tax custom and pre-written software, and this is regardless of how it's delivered. And similar to software, streaming services are also a challenge when you're talking about digital goods and digital services. Again, they are classified differently from state to state. In one state, streaming can be a digital good, while in another, it's an information service. And as a result, this makes them be treated differently when it comes to taxation. And then you have the states that don't tax streaming services unless they're specifically enumerated in statute. And then there are other cases where some jurisdictions do impose a local tax on streaming services, even if the state doesn't impose one. And there are existing taxation frameworks that have been developed to address digital products. The one that I'm discussing here is the streamlined sales tax. They actually prohibit the treatment of specified digital goods or items transferred electronically as tangible personal property. And I mention this and I bring them up because it's an important consideration for member states such as Nevada when they are drafting policy. The streamlined sales tax actually uses a product by product definition, and states can choose which products to tax and even add products that they want to tax. I'm going to note here that the streamlined sales tax treats pre-written software as tangible personal property instead of that specified digital product or a product transferred electronically. And this distinction is important because it's allowed states to tax pre-written software regardless of how it's delivered to consumers. And then in the past couple of years, and specifically focusing on last year, there have been legislative changes around digital taxes. In Louisiana, the legislature actually clarified that digital products are subject to the state sales tax and explicitly subjected software as a service to the state sales tax. In Maryland, the state expanded the sales tax to more digital services and stated that certain digital services that weren't subject to the state sales tax were now subject to, or are now subject to, a reduced 3% tax rate. And with commercial software as a service, that will be subject to a 3% reduced rate, while the individual use of software as a service will be taxed at the state rate of 6%. And then in Washington, we see that the definition of retail sale was expanded to also include professional digital services like the custom software development. And what these bills do is that they're showing the trend of moving from ambiguity towards explicit inclusion of digital products. And this is a change that's often driven by the changing revenue needs of states and also the digital market growth. And then we'll see here that most recently in Utah, lawmakers enacted a bill that imposes a tax on businesses that actually earn revenue from a targeted digital advertising. And although this piece of legislation has been enacted, it's almost sure to face challenges in court under the Internet Tax Freedom Act. And as I wrap up, I want to leave you all with some policy considerations when talking about digital taxes. First, it's pretty important to clearly identify which specific digital products and services are going to be included in the tax base when drafting policy. When statutes are unclear, there's a risk that taxpayers end up paying too much or too little in taxes, and it just makes for a confusing landscape. And states should also review the existing law tax exemptions to avoid any conflicts with the Internet Tax Freedom Act, which is the same act that is likely to cause issues for Utah's new targeted digital advertising tax. Next, states should also consider using the streamlined sales tax bundle transaction rule. And again, this is to reduce ambiguity or controversy around any digital taxes. States should also keep in mind any potential impacts of taxing business inputs when expanding the sales tax base to digital products. This is both to avoid effects on consumer prices and also to keep global competitiveness for in-state businesses. And related to that, it's important that states consider engaging business stakeholders early on in the process so they can determine whether a tax is administrable or if it's going to face legal challenges. With that, I want to leave you all with this policy brief that NCSL's SALT task force put together on the taxation of digital products, and also open up the floor to any questions that there may be about my presentation.
Members, any questions? Any questions up north? So can we get into the, it's on your slide on the policy considerations around the bundled transaction rule. So for streamlined sales tax, the rule is pretty interesting. Can you just give an example? Because I know when I was reading it, it was like, it's how you tax it is dependent upon like what is the majority part of the bundle. Is that a proper way to like interpret it?
I would say yes. So they state that if the bundle includes one taxable item, the full charge for the bundle becomes taxable. But with that being said, they do have administrative rules. So the first one being that if the seller makes the prices of separate elements available at the time of sale to the consumer, such that they're not being sold together for a single price, then the transaction will not be treated as a bundle. But if there are, and I should say not but, if there are bundles that include taxable items, that represent 10% or less in value compared to the other items in this bundle, then those items will be excluded from or the entire bundle, sorry, will be excluded from taxation.
So thank you for that. Because the thing that I guess I'm trying to sort through is, there are these new products coming online almost every day, right? And so you're familiar with the, I guess I'm going to call them book talks, TOK, meaning it's showing up on Instagram. It is a book. You have a couple of ways that you can access material. You can access free a book up to a certain point as long as you watch these ads. And then if you choose not to watch the ads, then there is a fee per chapter. Could be $9.99, or you're paying $9.99 for some coins. And then when the coins run out, then you're subject to another cost to continue to read the next chapter. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I'm wondering if, it looks like Louisiana was the last one, and they have a really wide definition, which I actually like, on how are folks treating that, and what kind of transaction is that exactly? Because it has so many pieces. It has like an intangible coin, but it also has money that is being expended. And it's not a traditional book because they're forcing you to pay by chapter to read it. But it is a digital good. Have you had any of that like pop up, or any legislator in any of the other states bring that up?
We have not had that come up. I'm actually not familiar with book talk, so this is something that we can get an answer back to you after the presentation and after looking into it a little bit further.
Yeah, so I'll definitely share it with you offline, because it's an ongoing, it's on Instagram and it's on Facebook platforms of books that you can read by chapter, and you're literally paying for it. And it's the same thing as if it's an audio story, right? And so to me, they're digital works. They're reformatting of books in a different way, and also stories in a different way. And so I'm just trying to, see if anybody has captured it in their kind of catch-alls, but that's what I'm looking at. And I can send you examples on like what it looks like and how they're charging people, because it could be up to like almost $100 for you to get access to this online digital book if you're not choosing to pay for the per chapter setup.
That would be very helpful. I was not familiar with this, so any resources that you have or examples would be greatly appreciated.
I will definitely send over some screenshots of what they are, so people can be like, I've never seen that. Maybe I'm the only person that's like getting it in my feed. But I was just like, you look like you're taxable. That's what runs through my mind when I see it. But all right, thank you for that. Any additional questions? And then I just have one. Can you just break down business inputs? Because it's been used like, I was in the streamlined sales tax meetings, but ultimately when you say business input, I don't think there's I think most people hear it and don't really understand like what actually goes into a business input that would then make digital impact a problem, or digital revenue excise tax attached to it a problem.
Thank you, Senator Neal. So just to clarify, are you looking for, or you're asking for examples of what
yeah.
a business input is?
If you could just put some examples, like what is a business input and what is not a business input?
Okay. So business inputs would include so component parts for any research and development, or any research or development that goes towards the product that's being put out. I'm hesitant to pick out any parts or pieces. I'm not super familiar with business inputs for digital products specifically, and I'm more than happy to share well explained understanding of what those business inputs can look like via email to the entire committee, if that works.
That would work. I appreciate that. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, no, I thank you for coming and presenting. And it's always good information. And so, not seeing that members have any questions to you, I'm going to go to our next presenter, which I'm going to call up Mr. Brian Wachter for the Retail Association to present on digital products.
Good morning, Chair Neal, members of the Interim Revenue Committee. My name is Brian Wachter. I'm with the Retail Association of Nevada. And we were asked here today to maybe provide some local context for what these decisions or lack of policy direction from the legislature has meant for digital taxes, and how our retailers and our local small businesses in Nevada are grappling with this. Many of us might remember spending our Friday nights at Odyssey Records or browsing the aisles at Big D's CDs. You might have sought out a video from Major Video or West Coast before you migrated to Blockbuster and Hollywood. You might have found your new favorite book at Borders. All favorites of an era, all taxpayers, all employers, and all gone. We represent thousands of retailers across the Silver State, from the mom and pop shops on 4th Street in Reno to major employers in the Las Vegas Valley. I'm here today to provide the committee some context for what it would mean for Nevada's small businesses should you choose to modernize the Nevada sales tax base to include digital goods and services. To be clear, our position is not about new taxes. It's about fairness, parity, and the survival of the physical storefront. As you heard, our current tax structure was largely codified in 1955. In 1955, tangible personal property meant something you could drop on your foot. If you bought a book, a record, or a movie, you paid sales tax to support Nevada's schools and local infrastructure. Today, a Nevadan can sit in a local coffee shop, bypass the local bookstore, and download that same book instantly to a tablet. Because the book is delivered via bits and bytes rather than paper and glue, it's tax exempt. Does the state's need for education funding disappear because a book is digital? No. Does the wear and tear on our infrastructure stop because a movie is streamed? No. Yet our tax code treats these identical consumption choices as if one exists in a real world and the other exists in a tax-free vacuum. We are effectively subsidizing out-of-state goods at the expense of Nevada's brick and mortar businesses. When a local retailer opens a shop in Elko or Henderson, they commit to Nevada. They pay property taxes, they hire local residents, and they collect sales tax. Currently, our tax code penalizes that commitment. If a Nevada resident buys a physical Blu-ray from a local shop, they pay 6.85% to an 8.35% tax. If they stream that same movie from an out-of-state provider, they pay 0. This is a government-mandated price disadvantage for Nevada's-based businesses. We are telling our entrepreneurs that if they choose to have a physical footprint and invest in our communities, we will make their products 8% more expensive than their digital out-of-state competitors. This is bad economic policy, and it's unfair to the people who keep our main streets vibrant. This is not yesterday's problem. Today is Wednesday. And on Wednesdays at Maximum Comics in Spring Valley, the Wednesday Comic Run is a tradition that supports jobs and storefronts. Every one of those issues carries a sales tax. But if a fan switches to a digital subscription to read those same stories on an iPad, the state's revenue disappears. We are incentivizing Nevadans to stop visiting their local comic shops and start feeding out-of-state algorithms instead. If a parent goes to the Family Music Centers off Ann Road to buy a physical book of piano scales for their child's first lesson, they pay sales tax. But if they download a How to Play app or a digital sheet music from a server from another state, they don't. We are effectively taxing physical tools for education while giving digital versions a free pass. If I walk into Grassroots Books in Reno and I buy a physical copy of The Great Gatsby, I'm helping the state. But if I download that same book onto an online platform, I'm paying no tax. If a group of friends walk into the little magic shop in Las Vegas to buy a hardcover book to start a new adventure, they're going to pay taxes. But if they sit at home and buy the exact same instruction manuals on an app, Nevada gets nothing. We are quite literally taxing the weight of paper and subsidizing a digital PDF. And lastly, when a collector goes to Retro City Games in Henderson and tries to find a classic Nintendo cartridge from their childhood, we tax that nostalgia. Yet if that same person stays on their couch and pays a monthly subscription fee to stream that exact same 30-year-old game, they pay zero tax. And our code rewards the digital download and punishes the local shop owner who keeps our gaming history alive. We all know that consumer behavior has shifted. We are moving towards a service and digital economy. As more goods transition from physical to digital, Nevada's sales tax base, the engine of our general and local funds, naturally shrinks. By refusing to modernize, we are watching our revenue go dark. This shift puts an unsustainable burden on the shrinking pool of physical goods. In fact, Nevada has repeatedly relied on adding local sales tax options that raise the cost of physical goods as a quick fix to long-term funding needs. Broadening the base to include digital goods allows us to keep rates lower for everyone while ensuring the tax code reflects how Nevadans actually spend their money in 2026. And as an aside, Chair, I think that's an excellent answer to your question about how we can reduce some of the regressivity in the sales tax. And maybe it's not all of it, but if we lower that rate when we're applying it to back to school or the necessities of living that aren't exempt, that lower rate will eliminate some of that regressivity in the sales tax. We understand concerns about complexity. However, Nevada is already a member of the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement. Over 30 other states, including our neighbors in Arizona and Utah, already tax digital goods successfully. In fact, when states have passed similar legislation, their estimates for how large this portion of the digital economy have proven very conservative. Pennsylvania initially projected roughly $50 million annually from its digital sales, and in reality, the state ended up collecting $200 million in its first full year, nearly 4 times its original projection. Chicago was the first major U.S. city to extend its amusement tax to streaming services. Their result? Revenue from digital services soared from $40 million in 2017 to over $148 million by 2021. We saw that right here in Nevada after passing the marketplace facilitator language and its effect on our state budget during the COVID crisis. The lessons to take away is that digital consumption is growing much faster than the overall economy. A tax base that includes digital goods is future-proof in a way that a physical-only base is not. We aren't asking the committee to reinvent the wheel. We are asking for you to adopt the definitions and the standards that are already working across the country. This ensures that the administrative burden on small businesses is minimized while ensuring compliance from every retailer. In closing, the Retail Association of Nevada believes that a tax code should be neutral. It shouldn't pick winners and losers based on whether a product is delivered in a cardboard box or via email attachment. Modernizing the tax code to include digital goods is about ending the Main Street penalty. It's about ensuring that the local record store and the global streaming giant have to play by the same rules. We look forward to working with this committee on its work as we address going into the 2027 legislative session, and we hope to be able to help Nevada's small businesses in a way that is fair, predictable, and reflective of the modern economy. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Members, do you have any questions to Mr. Walker? So I have at least 3. Okay, so the first one, because you mentioned in your presentation subscriptions, right? So that was a heavily debated conversation from 2019 to now about the treatment of subscriptions. And, you know, Rhode Island currently taxes subscriptions because it's the way in which folks are receiving the information, right? So is there, I don't know, I don't even know if it's appropriate to ask you that, but a general opinion around including, you know, if it's a download and a subscription in the language?
Brian Walker with the Retail Association of Nevada. I think it actually fits right there in that home right between the hybrid between service and product. And so I think, the state's going to have to take a position on whether or not it wants to continue to do that. I think there is no way that we're going to be able to pass modernization legislation specifically towards moving to digital goods that is not going to change how people are consuming these products, because we are entering that fight kind of so far after this market has already been agreed on. No matter what we do is going to affect some pressure point, but I think we need to take an overall look at what's the policy of the state, what was sales tax intended to do, and how do we make sure that's reflected in today and tomorrow's economy. And so if today and tomorrow's economy looks more like subscription-based services, and I hadn't had the opportunity to know anything about a by chapter book service, but if that's the direction the economy is going, then the state would be certainly at a disadvantage if it wasn't going to take into consideration how to look at that activity.
No, I appreciate that, because I do think that when you talked about like Main Street businesses, that when you start to create parity within market frameworks, you also reset behavior to a degree, right? You also, I believe, give a fighting chance to brick and mortar, where folks are saying, well, if I'm going to pay the same price, then I might as well just go to the store, right? Versus download. Second question, I don't know if you know this, but if any of the retailers, have they experienced any audio works that are literally at this point, they are AI generated audio work? Because I'm seeing it all the time, like literally folks are like, oh, I did this video and it's audio work, but it's AI generated and it's a download. And so to me, it is now becoming there is a hybrid AI audio. There is also AI hybrid books that I feel should also be captured, but I don't really know the companies that are doing it. Like they seem to be, I don't know who they are actually, but do any of your retailers have a relationship, or are any of them doing that kind of AI hybrid stuff?
Brian Wachter with the Retail Association of Nevada. Yes. But I think it's important when we take a look into this, it's less about the content creator, whether you're a human author, whether you're a robot author, and the hybrid of even that, right? We can have a conversation about auto-tune and what computer tools that we've been using in music in order to get from where we were and where we are today. And so to say that something is 100% human created versus, I think, an intelligent or a computer assisted creation is, I think, for a different venue. I think the important part for the state is that we have this product that's been created. We tax it under similar circumstances. If it's tangible, how do we make sure that that tax activity is still occurring, even with the advent of all these new avenues? I think if the state were to try to spend all of its time understanding all these definitions and making sure that, whether it was AI created or human created, and there was a distinction in the tax code, we'd be better spent saying, this is the policy of the state. These are the taxable environments in which we expect taxation to occur. If you have put something new into that sandbox that the state hasn't figured out how to define, but it is clearly within that activity, then that should be included. And so we would caution the approach less about the tool or the mechanism and how you created it, and more, what is the actual consumable item being consumed?
Point taken. I'm just wondering, because and I get what you're saying, but do you think, and this is just a general opinion, because computer pre-written software it's been included in a lot of states, do you think the AI audio work should be somehow included in the computer pre-written software as like some kind of like expanded definition? Because technically it is, I would say, a computer or some kind of program that generated it, but it is not necessarily custom. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out like how to touch it, either in X category or just generally touch it because it is an audio work, and in whatever derivative it shows up, it is an audio work being downloaded. Therefore, it is in category X and subject to excise tax.
Brian Walker at the Retail Association. I think that example is really easy when you get into like music, because you can right now go onto the Apple iTunes store and download an artist that is entirely AI created. And they're very upfront about that. They tell you you're not downloading someone you think is a human that turns out to be AI. You can download an AI band or that record or just the single. And I would anticipate that we would want a state approach to policy that would tax that regardless of whether or not it was created by a computer program or a human. I think when you get into software, you certainly, that is going to be a distinction. And I think some of the states have made the distinction that if the same product is offered tangibly in a cardboard box on a shelf, then that's where that parity sets in. I think probably over the course of your work on this issue, we do need to come to a conclusion on what is customizable and what's not customizable in terms of how customized does it have to be before it becomes customized software. And I think that's an important part. I would go back though to your question, Senator, when you asked about those business inputs and why I think the bills that have been introduced at the legislature have been very good about this and previously is because making sure that we're not pyramiding those taxes. So software as a service and cloud computing could have a negative effect towards business operations. And when that happens, as retailers, we pass along that cost directly onto consumers. And so you are going to be raising the base cost of those goods at the same time that you're raising the tax rate on them. And so if we can keep this directly to those end user consumer goods is where we're going to see the most efficiency, the most revenue that's going to come in, and have the ability to kind of really solidify the foundation as we move forward. Certainly there is more money, I guess I would say, in the other way, but you are really starting to get into negative consequences and kind of having the opposite of effect of what you're trying to have, which is to improve Nevadans' lives.
So thank you for that. And then final question is on services, right? So I've been, since the digital goods bill has been presented in the legislature, it has like put a baby toe into like services when we started talking about hybrid goods. One of the examples I think we used in I think 21 and 23 was is it called Mirror, where literally you're exercising and then part of the exercise is this service, which is a video that's attached, which is telling you, how to exercise or how to do this, that, and the other. It was like the upgrade. I remember using it, saying it was the upgrade from who was the guy that with the headband that Michael died? Richard Simmons videos, where you were doing the Richard Simmons, VHS tape, and he was telling you how to, do lunges. And now all of a sudden it's associated with the Peloton, or it's associated with the Mirror, where, now a person is exercising and you are modeling in that mirror. And that is like, it's a hybrid good, but it's a service product crossover. And so I am interested, and there are more actually like this. Even if it's just something like Tai Chi walking, and you guys are seeing that a lot, right? The Tai Chi walking videos. But I'm just saying, like, I'm constantly thinking about I'm just thinking like, I feel like I'm the only person that's on YouTube. But like, I feel like there's so many more products, and I'm actually glad that probably this didn't pass in like 23, 25, just because new products have shown up that I feel are worth a discussion, and hybrid pieces are worth a discussion that are service related that I feel like should be included in this bill. But are you familiar with any, we've talked about the services issue, right? And like opening the door to services, which based on Mr. Nakamoto's presentation has clearly been a part of Nevada's history. But do you think that the industry is ready for a services conversation?
Brian Wachter at the Retail Association of Nevada. First, I am looking forward to subscribing to Mr. Nakamoto's TikTok channel on Nevada tax history. And if he doesn't have one yet, we're going to get him all set up on that. I think, I remember the 2011 hearings as well, when we were kind of shoved off at Great Basin Community College because we didn't want to have these conversations at the legislative campus. And so, yes, it is fraught. But we have known since 1980, since the tax shift, but we have actually paid taxpayer money more than multiple millions of dollars to restudy this fact every couple of sessions as to whether or not we are letting the vast majority of our economy go untaxed in Nevada. And so that's a conversation that is going to stay with us forever because of the total economic activity in Nevada. We tax about 20% of it. When Nevada doesn't have an income tax, when it doesn't have other tools that states have, then you have to use, I think, the economy that you have. And so I think it's short-sighted on the state's part that we are not entering into those conversations because it does represent such a large place of the employment and an economic base. Those folks are utilizing government services the same way that traditional businesses and certainly those in the tangible field are. And so again, we would be looking for parity there. I would also note that I think the opportunities for revenue there are much greater than some of the other recent additions to the Nevada tax code that we've had that may have not facilitated their original purposes when you passed them. The commerce tax, for one, was supposed to be a tax that was specifically to out-of-state businesses that were going to bring in folks that weren't currently paying the tax now. That doesn't happen very regularly. In fact, it's the same businesses that pay the MBT that are paying the commerce tax, they're paying everything else. And so if we're going to look at the state needing to add to its tax code and look at revenue generation, then services are something that needs to be front and center.
So I appreciate that. Maybe that's something for a future conversation because, not to get into the commerce tax, but like we were all part of that. Well, me and Nakamoto were a part of that conversation. But because I've always wondered, did we exempt out the out-of-state businesses and all that, and all of those exemptions that we created in the commerce tax, where basically we're not touching the out-of-state businesses as much as we thought we would because the carve-outs.
Brian Wachter at the Retail Association. I think if you went back and looked at the Retail Association testimony from the 2015, you would find that we would agree with that.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know none of the people that are just currently going to be up for election the following year after the 2027. But I do think that it's worth a conversation only because it was such a politically, I don't know if it was politically hostile, it might have been. But it was a very brave act on the part of, at the time, Governor Sandoval to bring that up. And I think it was very carefully, there were careful treads that happened during that hearing, although very long and all day. But I do think that has always been something that stuck with me since 2015, are all of the carve-outs that were created that specifically were large hedge funds and other groups that I felt like should have been in and they weren't, and then yada, yada. But I don't want to put that on Mr. Nakamoto, even though I may. But because I'm looking at everything, right? I want to modernize our revenue, period, right? Not just digital goods. I want to look at where we can make small wholesale changes that ultimately create stability in the revenue that we need for the services that we need in Nevada. I don't know, we have a series of decisions that I think we need to make. And I think folks, sometimes reintroducing those pieces helps bring it back to the front of people's minds because we forget so much. And then it just becomes a talking point rather than, is this something that we should look at and like really examine? So, well, I appreciate the dialogue and the input and you taking time out of your day to come and present to us. I always love having, very thoughtful and intense debate with the retail and you. So it's always welcome. All right, you guys, we can power through and then you take lunch home. And our final will be agenda item number 7. We're closing agenda item number 6 to agenda item number 7, which are year-to-date actual collections for the state general revenue fund. And Mr. Nakamoto, you're up, and I believe is Ms. Powers also going to present?
Ms. Powers, Michael Nakamoto for the record, Ms. Powers will be doing the presentation from Carson City, and I am her phone a friend.
Oh, okay, so Ms. Powers, you may begin.
Thank you, Chair Neal. For the record, Susanna Powers, Deputy Fiscal Analyst with the Fiscal Analysis Division. I have with this. This agenda item 7 begins on page 151 of the meeting packet. And just give me a second to pull it up on the screen. It seems we're having some issues with the feedback. Are you able to hear me in Las Vegas?
Yes, ma'am.
It appears there are some technical issues. So I will do my best to just keep going, and please let me know if I need to pause for any technical reasons. As I mentioned, this agenda item begins on page 151 of the meeting packet. It is table 5, and it provides updated information on all unrestricted general fund revenue sources based on agency reports received through February 2026. In addition to 1 more month of collections, this table also now reflects 2 full quarters of tax collections from the Department of Taxation. Overall, we have not observed significant changes compared to the previous revenue report. As shown at the bottom of page 155, total fiscal year 2026 general fund revenue is $255.3 million, or 8.9% above last fiscal year's level at the same point in time. This is slightly overstated due to phase 1 of Project Mint at the Department of Taxation, which began with the November 2025 collections and captured only about half of the actual revenue for sales and use tax and few other excise taxes. The impact is most pronounced for sales and use tax due to its large share of total revenues. The Department of Taxation made a catch-up posting at the close of fiscal year 2025. However, due to the structure of our revenue tracking methodology, the distortion will not fully resolve until the end of fiscal year 2026. Relative to the Economic Forum forecast for fiscal year 2026, and after adjusting for Project Mint timing issues, we are approximately $150 million ahead of where we would typically expect to be at this stage of the fiscal year. About two-thirds of the $150 million cushion, or $107 million, represents one-time windfall revenue. This includes a $27 million gain from a change in the sales and use tax accounting close date and roughly $80 million in fiscal year 2025 commerce tax revenue that was delayed into fiscal year 2026 due to last fall's cyber attack. I do not have any other comments on the table 5. However, I'm ready to answer any questions, and Michael Nakamoto will be ready as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Members, any questions? So, Assemblywoman Backus.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And I just wanted, and I may just be repeating you and it may be easy. Thank you so much for your presentation. But so I went back to look at page 151, just kind of thinking about Project Mint and some of the issues that we experienced, I think, last year with its implementation. And then when the sales tax collection revenue showed. So if I understood you correctly, the makeup is 20, well, no, that was different. That was for the change in when the sales tax was collected. But when I'm looking at page 151, the difference to date looks like it's about 141 million. That's not all due to Project Mint. I'm assuming there's probably some economic factors that are increasing the sales tax as well.
Vice Chair Backus, for the record, Susanna Powers. Thank you for the question. So that amount, I believe you may be looking at for sales and use tax, where we are fiscal year 2026 year to date. The difference between this year and the last year at the same point in time is 140 million. So basically, when we look at the fiscal year 2025 year-to-date amount, it is not reflecting half of the revenue that was missing from the November 2025 distribution. So therefore, it is artificially deflated by about $75 million, if I remember correctly. And I know Mr. Nakamoto will correct me if I did not remember that amount correctly. However, the Department of Taxation did put that money into the correct fiscal year, which was the fiscal year 2025, at the end of last fiscal year. So once we close the books for fiscal year 2026 and compare the year-over-year results, this distortion will disappear. But at this time, the number that we are comparing to currently to the previous fiscal year is missing about $75 million. I hope that answers to your question, and I have a feeling Mr. Nakamoto may want to add perhaps something, or hopefully I didn't say anything that was incorrect. Thank you.
Madam Chair and Assembly Member Backus, Michael Nakamoto for the record. The $75 million number that Ms. Powers referenced is accurate, or at least to our knowledge. So the FY25 number is probably about $75 million lower than it should be. And then the other issue that is baked in there is that FY26 number is inflated by about that $27 million that Ms. Powers had previously mentioned. So you take those two into combination, and that's $102 million of it right there. So there is probably some economic activity that is baked into this, but I think the bigger drivers right now, the reason why those numbers are so high is because that FY25 number is so low, and then that FY26 number got propped up by that 27 million due to that shift in the reporting time that basically gave one-time revenue to the state.
Thank you.
So thank you for that, Mr. Nakamoto. So just to put it in just like plain terms, right? So the Mint system has not caught up or is catching up on revenue. So when folks see this $255 million number, how should they look at that? How should they interpret that? How should they interpret it? I'm just leave it there.
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. Anybody who looks at that $255 million number should take it with a grain of salt, or several grains of salt. And that's basically the few things that we've mentioned. The $107 million of that is due to the windfall revenue that is either the $27 million from the timing change of the sales tax that we just picked up as one-time revenue, or the $80 million of FY25 commerce tax revenue that is now posting in FY26. So in reality, if it were not for those things, Ms. Powers is right. We would be about $150 million above the forecast right now. But again, the $150 million is mitigated by that. Basically, what I would say, if anybody asks about that $250 million, is don't read too much into it. That basically, when you start accounting for all of those things, we're really just about $40 million above the forecast, which on a just over $6 billion state general fund is not a lot of revenue. I mean, we're certainly better off than being short, but right now I would say that as I think I've said before, when I've been asked this question, the state is really holding its own. The economic forum's forecasts took into account some of the economic conditions and were probably fairly conservative. And I think that the actual revenues are kind of meeting that expectation right now.
So how long, as far as Department of Taxation, how long are we going to continue to see, I guess I'm going to call it catch up, where we're going to see these drops of revenue that don't actually belong in the year in which we are seeing it?
Madam Chair, Michael Nakamoto for the record. I don't know if I want to be too much in the position of speaking for the Department of Taxation, but the issue that we're experiencing now with phase 1 of Mint really resolves itself by the end of FY26 because of that that 13th posting that they made at the end of the fiscal year. That's when we'll finally have an apples to apples comparison. Phase 2 of Mint has rolled out, and so that includes the modified business tax, and there are a couple of others that are in there. We haven't noticed significant distortions in revenue when we're looking at those. So we're hoping that the department has learned some valuable lessons from phase 1 and how they reported revenue, because we're really not seeing that as part of phase 2. So we're hoping that once we get past FY26, at least the Mint distortions will have worked themselves out. That doesn't mean we still won't have distortions in FY27. For example, commerce tax is going to look like it is significantly down in FY27 once we account for the $80 million from FY25 that posted into FY26. But again, those things can happen, and that is going to happen, but it's, again, not a Mint issue.
Okay, so I appreciate that. Just trying to get this get this clear on the record so that folks are like, why are we talking about revenue and, we're swimming in money, which is not true. So I keep just trying to put it in plain language because not everybody speaks tax speak. So I appreciate it. Appreciate the presentation. Is there anything else you want to add, or we just go ahead and close this agenda item now?
Madam Chair, I don't have anything else to add unless there are further questions for either Ms. Powers or myself.
No, I don't believe I have any questions, but if I'm forgetting something, because I know I forgot to ask something last time, and then just remind me. I'm not forgetting to ask anything, am I? No. You want to? Yeah. Assemblywoman Back.
I'll go ahead and echo something, because one thing we're also looking at is we're looking at year to date under fiscal year 2025 and fiscal year 2026, which is like February of the fiscal year, which obviously we end June 30th. And when you look at the comparison from fiscal year 2024 to fiscal year 2025, the growth was almost like flat. You look at those total, the general fund revenue after tax credits at the bottom of page 155, you were about 6 million. And then coming into fiscal year 2025, we were slightly, I think only like $4 million, $3 million, actually less than $3 million higher. And so it'll be interesting to see where we're at, given like the issues obviously with Mint that's kind of throwing off what kind of had transacted. So that will be interesting when we have the full fiscal years in to look at.
Assembly member Back is Michael Nakamoto for the record, and this actually is a good point to mention something that I was going to mention at the end of the meeting. At the Legislative Commission meeting on February 26th, based on direction or conversation that happened during the first meeting of this committee in January, and then at direction of the chair, we made a request to the Legislative Commission for an additional meeting for this committee to occur after the Cannabis Advisory Commission submits their study on cannabis taxes. So tentatively, it would be sometime in October. At that meeting, we would be able to give you the final FY26 statistics and how it compares to the forecast. By that point, all of the issues that we've discussed should be resolved, and we will be able to tell you what the fiscal year is compared to FY25 and then compared to the forecast as an apples to apples. But I did want to make that note that the Legislative Commission did approve that request, so that meeting will occur.
So thank you for that. So we will go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Nakamoto, Ms. Powers. We will go ahead and close agenda item number 7 and then open up for public comment, which is agenda item number 8. Go ahead.
Oh, it is afternoon. Good afternoon, Chair Neal, Vice Chair Bacchus, and committee members. For the record, Becky Dutro, DUTRO with Nevada Taxpayers Association. While all the interim committees work hard and are important to our legislative process, I do want to take a moment to recognize that this may be the most important of the interim committees and thank all of the committee members for your time and dedication to the fiscal affairs of the state. Although the NTA may have been a little delayed in coming to the table during the 2025 session, we plan to be more proactive as we prepare for the 2027 session and look forward to working with this interim committee and the 2027 committees on a collaborative effort towards good tax policy, fairness of all taxpayers, and accountable government revenue and spending. I look forward to meeting with some of you on specific topics, and please feel free to reach out to the association if you have any questions about our position or we can assist with any information related to these important topics. Again, I want to express my appreciation to you for serving the Nevada taxpayers.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Cassie Charles on behalf of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. Here very much, again, to thank this hardworking committee for all of your work. We know that any progress for state workers, any incremental progress we can ever make for state workers has to rely on our revenue structures. And we appreciate all of the deep dives that this committee does into how we can make progress and how that progress will benefit not only our state workers, but the state services that the state provides. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any additional comments? Anyone up north for public comment? Not seeing anyone. Can we go to the phone line?
Thank you, Chair. If you'd like to participate in public comment, please press *9 on your phone to take your place in the queue. Chair, the public line is open and working. However, there are no callers wishing to speak at this time.
Okay, thank you for that. So with that, we will close agenda item number 8, public comment, and then we will go to agenda item number 9, which is adjournment.
Senator, can I just make one quick
statement? Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. I just want to take this time to make a very special, I think a very historic sort of a commentary on something that's taking place here today in this country, on this planet. And that is an individual who's very special to me, a fraternity brother, a friend of mine. And we all have friends who I think done great things, achieved great heights. But I want to give a special shout out to Captain Victor Glover. I first met Captain Glover 20 years ago, spring of 2006, while pledging Phi Beta Sigma fraternity. He was a big brother I was assigned to reach out to while I was online. I was a sophomore at UNLV, and he was an F-18 fighter pilot. We have been friends since. Now he will be piloting NASA's Artemis 2 mission to the moon. Victor, I am so proud of you, and not just as a brother of Sigma, not just as a fellow American, but as a member of the human race. Godspeed, frat, as you embark on a mission to set forth another giant leap forward for all mankind. I love you, my brother. Go Mob, and safe travels.
Thank you for that. And then we have a comment for Mr. Nakamoto.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michael Nakamoto for the record. I just wanted to announce that this is going to be my last meeting with this committee. I am moving on to bigger and better things. And then I would also like to wish you all a happy April Fool's Day. Thank you.
That is horrible. That's horrible. That's just like, I
No,
was literally
sir,
like,
you knew.
did you not share this with me? Yeah. All right, April Fools. Thank you, Mr. Nakamoto, for sending us out to our lunch with that. Thank you. It's awesome. All right, we are adjourned.